Imagine the weight of a sentence that lasts for eternity. To be cast out of the light of the church is not merely a social exile. In the 13th century, it was the death of the soul itself. This is the story of Frederick II, a man branded as the Antichrist, a king who played a high-stakes game of chess with God's representative on earth, and a ruler who realized too late that while you can conquer the world with iron and silver, you cannot negotiate with the silence of the grave. The danger here isn't just a sword at the throat, it is the slow, cold realization that a man who owns 3 kingdoms can still die a beggar in the eyes of the divine. To understand the darkness that surrounded Frederick, one must understand the 7 sacraments that bound the medieval world together. From the first drop of water at baptism to the final morsel of the Eucharist, these were the invisible chains of the soul. There was the sacrament of marriage, which Frederick used like a weapon, and the sacrament of unction, the holy oil applied to the dying to wash away the sins of a lifetime. For a common man, these were comforts. For a king like Frederick, they were bargaining chips. He was a man who lived between the sacred and the profane, a polyglot who spoke 6 languages and whispered secrets in 4 more, raised in the shadows of the Vatican only to become its greatest nightmare. Frederick's story begins in a cradle of cold ambition. He was an orphan of the highest order, the son of the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI and Constance of Sicily. When his parents died, the boy was left in the care of Pope Innocent III. Imagine the irony, the very institution he would one day seek to dismantle was the one that fed him, taught him Latin, and schooled him in the intricacies of theology. He was meant to be the Church's golden boy, the King of Kings who would finally secure the Holy Land. But the Vatican forgot one thing blood always remembers. Frederick didn't just inherit a throne, he inherited a centuries-old grudge against the papacy. By his 30s, Frederick had become a titan of Europe. He was the King of Sicily, the King of Germany, and the Holy Roman Emperor. But he was a man of cold calculation, especially when it came to women. He didn't marry for love, he married for maps. When he set his sights on the Kingdom of Jerusalem, he didn't send an army, he sent a marriage proposal. He took Isabella, a 13-year-old princess, as his bride simply because she held the title to the Holy City. He consumed her youth and her heritage, and once he had the legal right to the crown of Jerusalem, she was relegated to the shadows of history. This was Frederick's way, a world of cold iron and colder hearts. The conflict reached a boiling point with the Sixth Crusade. The previous crusades had been bloodbaths, failures that left thousands dead in the mud of the Nile. The Pope demanded a new holy war, and Frederick promised to lead it. But he stalled. He claimed he was ill, clutching his stomach while the Pope fumed in Rome. Was he truly sick, or was he merely waiting for the political winds to shift? The Church didn't care for his excuses. For the sin of delay and the suspicion of heresy, Pope Gregory IX did the unthinkable, he excommunicated the emperor.
Don't get too close.
Frederick was now a man without a church, a king who was legally a ghost in the eyes of his own people. Most men would have crumbled, but Frederick was built of different stuff. In an act of pure defiance, the excommunicated emperor set sail for the Holy Land anyway. He didn't go with a massive host of knights, he went with 3,000 men and a silver tongue. While the church wanted a massacre, Frederick wanted a deal. He entered into secret negotiations with the Sultan of Egypt, Al-Kamel. They were two intellectuals who respected each other's power more than their respective gods. In a move that scandalized all of Christendom, Frederick negotiated a 10-year truce. He won Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth without spilling a single drop of blood. But it was a hollow victory. The Sultan gave him the cities, but he kept the Temple Mount and the Dome of the Rock for the Muslims. To the Christians of Europe, this wasn't a triumph, it was a betrayal. Frederick had negotiated with the infidel instead of destroying him. When he walked into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre to be crowned King of Jerusalem, no priest would touch him. He was a spiritual leper. In an act of supreme hubris, Frederick reached out, took the crown with his own hands, and placed it on his own head. He told the world that he didn't need God's blessing to be a king. He was the law. He was the emperor. He was alone. The darkness only deepened when he returned to Europe. The Pope, enraged by this false crusade, launched a military campaign against Frederick's own lands in Sicily. The father figure of the Vatican was now trying to kill his foster son. Frederick fought back with a brutality that shocked his contemporaries. He didn't just defend his lands, he pushed his armies toward Rome itself. He viewed the Pope not as a holy father, but as a rival landlord who had overstepped his bounds. He famously quipped that the Pope was merely the bishop of a city, while he was the emperor of the world. To understand why Frederick was so comfortable defying the heavens, we have to look back at his ancestor, Henry IV. History is a cycle of trauma, and the German emperors had a long memory. A century before Frederick, Henry IV had faced his own excommunication. He had tried to appoint his own bishops, challenging the Pope's spiritual monopoly. The backlash was so great, and his nobles so rebellious, that Henry was forced into the most humiliating act in the history of royalty. He crossed the frozen Alps in the dead of winter, dressed in the rags of a penitent, and knelt in the snow outside the gates of Canossa for 3 days and 3 nights, begging for the Pope's forgiveness. That image of a shivering king in the snow haunted the German psyche. When Frederick II rose to power, he swore he would never kneel. He saw the Church's power as a parasite on the state. He built a network of spies, hired Saracen bodyguards who owed no allegiance to the Pope, and surrounded himself with poets and scientists who questioned the very fabric of the universe. He was a man living 500 years ahead of his time, but he was doing it in a world that still burned heretics at the stake. But even the most defiant flame eventually flickers. Frederick's later years were a descent into paranoia and loss. His own son, Henry, turned against him, seduced by the promises of the papacy. Frederick was forced to crush his own blood, throwing his son into a dungeon where he eventually died. His armies, once invincible, began to falter against the Lombard League in northern Italy. At the siege of Parma, while Frederick was away hunting, the enemy made a sudden sortie and burned his entire camp to the ground, including his treasury and his mobile capital. He returned to find only smoke and ash. The emperor who had outsmarted sultans and defied popes began to crumble from within. The weight of his excommunications, he had been cast out twice now, began to press down on him. In the medieval mind, the Antichrist wasn't just a title, it was a destiny. As his health failed, the shadows of his upbringing in the Vatican returned to haunt him. He had spent his life treating the sacraments as political tools, but as the breath began to leave his lungs, they became the only things that mattered. On his deathbed in 1250, the Stupor Mundi, the wonder of the world, was no longer a titan. He was a frightened man looking into the abyss. There is a deep historical debate about his final moments. Some say he died in his sins, a rebel to the end. But others record a more chilling scene. It is said that Frederick, in his final hours, sent a desperate plea for a local priest. He who had mocked the holy oil and the bread of life now begged for the sacrament of unction. He wanted his sins washed away. He wanted to return to the light before the darkness claimed him. There is a profound irony in the death of such a man. On one hand, he was a visionary who built universities and established laws that protected the poor. On the other, he was a cold-hearted tyrant who used people like pieces on a board. He won the holy city with a pen and lost his soul with a sword. The priest who finally performed the last rites for him took a massive risk, for Frederick was still technically excommunicated. But in the face of death, the theological battle lines blurred. The priest saw only a dying man, and Frederick saw only the fire. After his death, the Holy Roman Empire collapsed into a century of chaos known as the Great Interregnum. Without his iron will, the German states fractured, and the papacy found itself without its greatest rival but also without its greatest protector. The world Frederick built died with him, buried in a sarcophagus of red porphyry in Palermo. He had lived as a god among men, yet he died as a man terrified of God. The legacy of Frederick II serves as a dark warning about the nature of power. We often think of history as a series of battles and treaties, but at its heart, it is a struggle for the human spirit. Frederick tried to separate the crown from the cross, but in the 13th century, they were fused together with blood. He proved that you can occupy Jerusalem, you can speak every language under the sun, and you can hold the world in your palm, but you cannot escape the fundamental human need for grace. In the end, Frederick was a man of two worlds who belonged to neither. To the Muslims, he was a curious friend, to the Christians, he was a terrifying enemy. To his family, he was a distant shadow, to the Pope, he was the Antichrist. But as he lay on that final bed, the titles of emperor and king stripped away by the coming cold, he was just a boy raised in a cathedral, wondering if the God he had spent a lifetime defying would finally open the door, or if the 3 days of kneeling in the snow at Canossa was a debt that his bloodline could never truly repay. The thriller of history doesn't end with a bang, but with a whisper in a darkened room, as a king trades his empire for a single drop of holy oil.